Um, Good afternoon for some, good morning for others. This is Critical Talk, hosted by Professor Amina Al-Din for Muslim Network TV, which is a production of Sound Vision. And today I am honored to be talking with Susan Smith Richardson, who is an award winning editor with over 3 decades of experience as a newsroom leader producing innovative, powerful journalism, and is the chief executive officer of the Center for Public Integrity. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about the center, which is located in Washington, D.C. And what does the Center for Public Integrity, because people are wondering if we have any integrity, what does the Center for Public Integrity do?
well, thank you, Dr. Aldine. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be on your program. So you are so right. I don't know if there is much public integrity left in the world, especially when we look at some of what's happening with our elected officials. But let me tell you what our mission is. The Center for Public Integrity was started more than 30 years ago, and that word integrity was central to it. It was started by a former producer at 60 Minutes who moved on from 60 Minutes after ethical conflict over the impact of big tobacco companies on journalism with a particular program he was working on. He felt it was essential that journalism not be bought by corporate interest or by government interest, and that it stood solidly in the public interest. So the center was founded very much to look after those issues of integrity. The journalism can't be bought, sold, or compromised by big money or by the government. This was more than 30 years ago. And about a year ago, I took over as CEO of the Center for Public Integrity.
So I know it's an investigative journalism center. I also know that I and our listening audience are confused by the models who are doing journalism now, the cute faces who are reading teleprompters. And I have to admit, got to see an actual teleprompter. And I'm saying, okay, where are our investigative journalists? And I would rather have them reporting the news because they do it in a different way. I know they're in the newspapers, but we also have an issue with newspapers and their circulation in the day of all of this. I mean, what is it? Snapchat and TikTok and all of these things. So if you could speak to some of that, I'd appreciate it.
Oh yeah, that's a whole lot to unravel, but you just kind of stated the nature of the landscape now. It's very confusing for many folks to understand, where do I get my information? How do I vet my information? And bottom line, what is fact and what is fiction, right? So I want to just start first with the piece about investigative journalism. As you said, the Center for Public Integrity is an investigative newsroom. And what that means is we try to focus our work not so much on what's happening every day, which is what, TV feeds the beast, as we like to say. Yeah. And radio has to also. Let's just get real basic here. There's a 24-hour news cycle. Stuff is happening all the time. And cable TV, radio, one of their core functions is to feed that 24-hour nature of information. They also have opportunities to do investigative, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Our mission is strictly about that. We're not really trying to feed the daily beast. What we're trying to do is really focus on showing systemic problems. So, for example, think about some of the work we've done over the years looks in a deep dive way at immigration policy, going deeply into the records of Homeland Security and being able to say how many people were detained at a certain facility during that detention, what were the rates of violence committed against immigrants. These are the levels of reporting that take time, a lot of investment, document search. And often, because our government now, perhaps more than in the last 20 years, doesn't want to give us information, it in some cases requires lawsuits around the Freedom of Information Act. So our work takes time. It's data driven. It's often, involving lawsuits or invoking laws that are supposed to allow the public to have access to information. And our work is about systems. How are systems affecting people? How are systems oppressing and advantaging and disadvantaging different groups of people? It goes deep, it takes time, and it tries to get to the root of problems. That's what we do. And there are other organizations, we're not alone, that do that type of investigative journalism. So that takes time. But then you've got, all sorts of folks and all sorts of organizations working in journalism and media spaces. Since I was in my early 20s, I remember when TBS, or what eventually became CNN, came off the ground in the 80s. This was remember this? Such a new ball game when suddenly radio could give us access to information, but it really wasn't 24 hours. Then suddenly there's CNN. And when you think about it, we started getting 24/7 information all the time. And if there wasn't something new to say, there were people up there, as we call them, the chattering class, who were just there to talk. And all of that is, on the one hand, there's an element of that that's good. We've got more potential access to information. On the other hand, if you've got 24 hours and you've got a TV station there, you're going to start filling it in with sometimes just some noise. And the problem becomes the distinction between what each news platform does. We do investigative. CNN, MSNBC, they do a lot of daily, but they also try to have investigative journalism in there as well. I think it's harder to see that with those channels because we think of their bread and butter as, let's have the conversation with, Don Lemon, or let's have the conversation with Joy Reid. But they also do investigative. It is just not what they're branded for or known for.
Could you just say that again? That is so critical to conversations with someone who can give us all this information. We have investigative journalism, and then what are we looking at when we watch CNN and MSNBC?
Well, I think a lot of what you're looking for there is, CNN obviously has a big bandwidth to do news. And a lot of their focus is on giving you daily news from, the globe, right? And that's one kind of bucket of information, as I like to call it. The other thing they do in between is, with their host in their evening programming is, giving you conversations that are off the daily news, right? Think about what Don Lemon or has been talking about all week. They're having conversations off of what's been happening all week long with the 7 days of protest around the death of George Floyd and related issues. So they do news, daily news. They do conversations off the news, and they also do some investigative journalism. We tend to think of the investigative journalism they do as last because most of us know them for Don Lemon, or I'm going to watch and get me some quick headlines so I know what's happening today, and then we move on. But they do some investigative journalism just to be really comprehensive about all the work they do. But that is not what they lead with. Organizations like Center for Public Integrity, ProPublica, Mother Jones, The Intercept, we tend to focus more on, especially ProPublica and Mother Jones, we focus more on investigative journalism, which is we're doing the work that may take longer, that tries to get to the root of problems and to expose problems that aren't being talked about, often in the daily news cycle.
Can you give me an example of that? What are you working on?
I don't know if I'm going to give you a heads up on that, but I will tell you this. Remember all of and doesn't it seem like it was 10 years ago when we were talking about the impeachment proceedings with President Trump? Here we are. We've had boom, boom, boom. So many things happened back to back. I don't know. I can't keep up. So I can imagine, folks who are not in the middle of the making the journalism are like, what now? But I'm going to give you an example of something we did that is really about investigative journalism in a really pure, direct sense. So when all the conversation was going on around President Trump, and when his team actually authorized halting the military aid to Ukraine. And if you remember, the essence of one of the articles of impeachment was around President Trump's decision to, without informing Congress, to temporarily suspend military aid to Ukraine. Now, the timing of when he did that was the subject of a whole lot of conversation at the center of his impeachment. Well, one of our reporters who focuses on national security was able to get through a Freedom of Information lawsuit. We were able to get some of those redacted or blacked out documents between the Department of Defense, the Office of the Comptrollers, about the back and forth about Trump's decision to halt aid. This was important because in the big grand scheme of what he did, when he did it, and whether or not this was impeachable, this link about the timing of when he halted that aid was critical to understanding the whole issue behind impeachment. We were able, through sources who led us to ask for certain information and through a Freedom of Information lawsuit, to get critical communications that helped to understand the timing around this issue that was at the heart of his impeachment. That's a good example of just a straight ahead power of investigative journalism. But there are others as well. Recently, in the middle of the COVID crisis, we got information from the state of Georgia that talked essentially about the lack of resources at hospitals. Which had, of course, a huge effect on the ability to treat people who had COVID-19. So we're constantly trying to dig and open ourselves up to, information also from whistleblowers that really get to the truth of what's happening, not what we're being told by official sources, but what is actually happening. And as we know, many times, unfortunately for our democracy, what an official source is saying and the truth are two different things. I mean, just think about
absolutely. So in this, for example, in your example of Trump and the Ukraine kind of deal, one of the things many people tried to understand was, did Trump get impeached? Did he?
Oh, well, no, there were, he was impeached, but he was not, there were proceedings. I'm sorry. I always, I want to make sure I say this very, very clearly. Impeachment is a process. He went through the process, but he was not impeached on those charges. So he went through the impeachment process, but the inquiry, but the president was not impeached.
Okay, I got it. I just needed to have somebody with authority say that. When we look at your group and others like you, go digging for details, data, all kinds of things. And for our viewing audience, she is looking down at her telephone because she is the interim person between the reporters on the street and the lawyers. So just in case they get locked up, something good can happen in the end. In Washington, D.C., I got so many questions, it's ridiculous. So if I wander, bear with me. In Washington, D.C., on the news, viewers saw your president walking down, I'm not sure what it was. It looked like a very wide walkway, and all of these people behind him, and everybody was trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Then the next thing we know, we see him with the Bible turned
Mhm.
backwards, and then he had to turn it to the spine in front of a church that was closed because of COVID. And you're sitting there saying, okay, well, what is he doing? But doesn't he see that the church is closed because of COVID? And then maybe about 5 minutes later, the pastor of that church is blasting him about you trying to use the Bible to use that church, which he had not gotten permission from, uh, in some kind of political way. So if viewers were watching this, and I know that I think a day later, reporters had something in the
Mhm.
newspaper trying to talk about what we were seeing. Uh, Many in the community I'm talking to and others are wondering about this collision of religion, of politics,
Mhm.
of all kinds of things that people have formerly kept in certain, distinct categories that are no longer distinct.
Right. Oh, I just want to come back on one point to be very, very clear. I always get caught up in this, and my brain is like much, so I must apologize. Our president was impeached. The question was, he was not taken to trial. He was impeached on those articles, the two
Okay.
articles
Okay.
by the House. And I just want to come back and clarify. Every time I talk about impeachment and the impeachment process, after sitting here going through the inquiry, I always have to walk back through the technical explanation. So I don't want to spread any information, and I want to come back and be very, very
Yeah,
clear.
because it was so muddied
Yeah.
that people
Well,
were saying, well, what the hell happened here?
well, no, the difference was, you could be impeached on these articles, but he was not found guilty. So that, just to clarify the
Yeah.
distinction.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. And I'm sorry. My brain just passed right by because it was like that happened 100 years ago. So I want to make sure that I am not spreading any misinformation.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Aldine, will you come back to the question you just
Well,
asked
I
me?
was thinking about you're sitting there in Washington.
Mhm.
Um, what are well, I guess another way to ask it would be what are the themes, the tropes, the whatever that investigative reporters are going to go after now? Because
Mhm.
Trump marched down this, I want to call it a promenade, but I don't know if it was
Mhm.
that grand,
Mhm.
with all of these people who we couldn't identify. It was maybe Bill Barr, we could identify, but the rest of the people we didn't know who they were.
Mhm.
To stand in front of this church with a Bible turned backwards and then turned to its spine, saying nothing much.
Mhm.
How? I mean, we then saw the pastor of the church come out. He was furious,
Mhm.
and I was saying, okay, this is on the ground kind of
Mhm.
reporting that reporters were doing. But when people like you go to look at how that could have happened, or is
Mhm.
that important enough for
Mhm.
you to go look at how that could have happened?
President Trump being coming out and speaking with Barr and with the helicopters in the city.
Yeah.
Mhm. I mean, I'll tell you, our lane is not doing the daily news.
Yeah.
Our lane is trying to do a deeper dive behind what does what does this moment mean. So for
Talk
us,
about that. What
mhm,
does this moment
yeah,
mean?
I mean, I think there's a lot of historical context that through our journalism, we need to bring to this moment. There are a couple of things. We're launching a whole new initiative to begin to get into the deeper issues behind what's happening. So, I think there are many levels of reporting that are playing out, and there's some wonderful journalism happening. One, and the obvious issue that I believe everybody has kind of jumped on is, of course, policing. use of excessive force, efforts to reform police departments. But policing is one aspect of this. There's also, this is coming in the middle of, an epic crisis, the coronavirus pandemic that has left, around the world, so many people did, and, 100,000, approaching just incredible numbers in this country, and it's caused incredible unemployment across the board. So there's all this context for this moment. Mr. Floyd was killed. It's a policing issue that has come up over and over again, but it's coming at a moment of an unprecedented for our time pandemic that is causing a health crisis and an economic crisis. So there are a whole lot of factors that all are affecting this moment. So one of the things that we are doing as an investigative journalism organization is trying to understand that context. So how is the 50% unemployment of African Americans, for example, feeding into this moment and the protests that we're seeing? How are long-term and unresolved issues around policing feeding into it? But here's my bottom line. You could say in many ways this is old generational stuff about police violence and white supremacist violence, but it is also different coming in the context of COVID, which is a health crisis and an economic crisis. And then laying on top of this is what I've called in a recent analysis, the unfinished agenda that came up with Kerner, that has come up for decades. And it was this: the systemic racism that has left African Americans more so in a completely unequal situation relative to the rest of the country. So these systemic issues of racism and inequality have not been addressed. And as a result, those are feeding into this moment we're seeing right now with the pandemic and with the death of Mr. Floyd. So our role
but
here,
as you begin to dig, especially with the very poorly distributed healthcare. We already know things like many minority communities do not have access to healthcare, meaning there are not enough community centers, hospitals, small hospitals, which serve those communities have been closed. With all kinds of claims. Many of the people were on Medicaid, so therefore there weren't enough dollars there to even keep the hospitals running, let alone buy new equipment. But we also know that journalists, investigative journalists, went out and found that people were showing up at emergency rooms and being turned away. African Americans and Latino Americans had some of the highest mortality rates.
Absolutely.
So how do we begin to, is it the racism? Do you suspect that you will find the racism on the parts of physicians?
Well, there's been reporting done in the past about, what folks call very nicely cultural competency, right?
Right.
And you've seen the articles in, from the New York Times and other places that people have addressed this in the journalism, that there are many factors. There's access, there's, not having insurance, there's access to healthcare, which is a question of whether or not you have access in your community or you have to drive a long way to get quality healthcare. And there is the other issue of cultural competency.
Right.
And that speaks to a long history of, Black and brown people and interaction with, and especially African Americans, interaction with health professionals, whether or not symptoms reported by African Americans are going to be treated in the same way as they would by
exactly.
But there's history of this, and part of why we've seen over the years, so many physicians began to address these cultural competency issues is precisely because they understand that the medical community at large doesn't understand distinctions and how you need to approach different communities, or cultural factors that will affect your approach to healthcare, or issues that will just affect both your mental and your physical well-being. So
Well, do
cultural
you think that that
is part of it.
that that builds? Oh no. Do you think that that is a result of minorities still not accessing postgraduate work in medicine? The numbers have
Well,
gone down.
sure. I mean, in summary, I'm by no means an expert on this reporting. I've done some of it in the past. I know that we can't talk about a disconnect between having more people who come from communities of color being in those positions. Certainly, that could not hurt and should help and support increasing cultural competency in the medical community. So I don't think anyone would make an argument that having more African American or Latinx physicians would not be helpful. So it's a combination of many things, right? It's a system of healthcare. It is having competency, and it's having access. All of those, I think, have come together in a very brutal way with the coronavirus.
Well, now we have coronavirus still running around. Handmaiden 2 protests, problems with labor unions, economic problems because people are out of work or are underemployed. Businesses are going to pot, small businesses, which many minority communities participated in, and the demand for higher technological skills to get employed. That's a mess.
Yeah.
I want to be an investigative reporter when I grow up.
It's there's a lot of you'll have plenty of issues to explore, plenty of issues, but something I'm hearing in the conversation, and I think is so important, and it's another point about investigations. It's that they are not, it all intersects, right? The deepest investigation shows you may start off with you think I'm just dealing very simply with an issue around healthcare. And as the thread starts to unravel, it takes you to so many places. That's why I say the investigative journalism by its very nature becomes journalism about rooting out radical causes. It gets to the root, it gets to the systemic nature of all the issues we're dealing with. Because you can't pull a thread around policing essentially and not pull a thread that doesn't talk about white privilege, or that does not talk about economic privilege in many ways.
Oh, so two good points.
Intersectional.
What is, in the Muslim community, which is a community of the always been here, not likely to go anywhere people, and also immigrants and their descendants. What is white privilege?
Well, I'm looking at you as the academic.
Don't do that.
But I will tell you so I should turn the question back to you and say, how do you define white privilege? But if you want me to go first, I'll give you my based on having read a lot, and when I use it, which I think is, part of the language that I think is important, that in journalism we're beginning to see these words and this language and these conversations show up. I will just say very roughly, it is a system of laws, policies, practices, and beliefs that essentially lead to the privileging of white people over other people who are not white.
That's what an academic would say. See, you are an academic. There you go.
Yeah.
But
many academics such as yourself have had many conversations with me, and I've read a whole lot of this work. But
I think that there are covers when we talk about economic privilege, because one of the things that's not talked a lot about directly in this country is class. And so, but we kind of know that there's a Black economic class scale, There's a larger minority class scale. You have people thinking that because they bought an overpriced house that has 9,000 square feet, that
Mhm.
they're of the economic privileged. And
Mhm.
I'm not really, but there's no way for them to judge
Mhm.
except by existence in their own bubble. I got the biggest house of all the people in my community. So therefore, I'm saying, yeah, but you don't have as many
Mhm.
houses
Mhm.
as Trump's
Right.
grandson.
Mhm.
Well, I don't know if he's got a grandson,
Yeah.
but you
Mhm.
know what I mean?
Mhm. No, I think it's so powerful to bring up class. I think when you think about writing about groups broadly, as if there are no differences
Right.
among Latinos or among, people of South Asian ancestry or among African Americans. There are
Right.
differences. There are political differences, ideological differences, and as you're pointing out, class differences.
Right.
But here's something that, can't be, to me, overstated. Because yes, I think when you have more nuanced and comprehensive journalism about race, it recognizes differences within, right? And it's
Right.
not a very simple and what can be a narrow black-white frame. But I want to say this about class because this is where race, in many cases, continues to trump class when you think about a comparison. So we know that the value of a home owned by, could be your home, based on where you live. If you live in a neighborhood that is heavily African American, if you took your house and plopped it down somewhere else, your house would have an exponentially greater value if you
Yes.
plopped it down in a white neighborhood. And here you are, you are a highly educated woman. You have means relative to, someone who's scraping by on not even minimum wage, but
Right.
the value of your property, as you pointed out earlier, compared to that of not a Trump, but just, I'm going to say a regular middle class white person, the value of your property is going to be less than theirs. There was even research done by Mary Patilla, a researcher a scholar at Northwestern, and one of her two books, and I've forgotten which it is, that essentially talks about the, the essential difference of the value of our property. I mean, she makes that same point. The value of African American property compared to that middle class African American's property compared to that of a white working class person is less. Our value is less.
Yeah.
So the question of property and comparison to white people overall is valid because even if you are a highly educated African American, if you are going to live in a neighborhood that has a tipping point, in terms of all Black people being there, your property value is less, which means that the value of our assets are less. And that adds up to not just an income issue, but a racial wealth gap that is not accidental, but it's structural. The other thing related to class, this week a report was released by a group called the Economic Policy Institute, and they just looked at this point at African Americans. They'll have another report that is going to look at the Latinx community and income inequality and the racial wealth gap for the Latinx community. But in looking at the African American community, once again, they had all sorts of data. And one of the things, too, that was noted, even in terms of wages, we're not talking about wealth gap, but let's just talk about wages.
Okay.
An African American with, a college degree or above is still making less wages than his or her counterpart who's white.
Mm-hmm.
That is structural. That is simply, what else do we call this but racism? It's structural, it's systemic racism. So class certainly matters, and class is an important factor. But we also have to recognize, too, that some of this, based on the research, is down to attitudes, ideas around white privilege and systemic racism that stop people from being able to have comparable experience and comparable income, even
Well,
at your level.
well, I think many questions of are I'm hearing revolve around, well, they understand that George Floyd and Breonna Taylor
Mhm.
and Armand, I'm forgetting his last name, in
Arbery.
Georgia.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, okay, they were brutally killed.
mhm.
One with the truck, I mean, outside with the truck with white men chasing him down with shotguns. The
Right.
other with a knee on the neck. Uh, the Brianna is shot dead through her front door,
Mhm,
you
mhm,
know, and it's kinds and types, and people can understand folk. I mean, the list of the names that are around uh George Floyd's head is too darn long.
mhm,
But not able to understand all of the other things fueling the anger. It's
mhm,
not just those deaths.
mhm,
It's what
mhm,
we're talking
mhm,
about structural,
mhm,
systemic, all of the other synonyms that we could
mhm.
use
Right.
for a racism where you're in a concrete box.
Mhm, mhm. And I think that's so much of the, this has come up over and over again in journalism after uh, you just named a short list in a recent period of time
Mhm.
of Black people who were killed. If we go all the way back, I mean, well, that would take us forever. But let's just look at, and I talked about this in a recent piece. I just went back to 1992 in Los Angeles, and
Okay.
the unrest in Los Angeles after the police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King. And this was one of the first stories that I helped to manage as an editor, right? That
Okay.
was very much in the center of race and policing. And I think, forward to where we are now. Some
Can
can,
you just say a little bit more about that story?
yeah, when everything happened in Los Angeles in, 91, 92, and when the officers were acquitted, of course, South Central in Los Angeles went up in flames, massive protest and civil disturbances occurred throughout
Mhm.
the city. This was one of the first really high profile cases in which an African American was captured on video being beaten by police. I mean, this was the watershed moment, in what has now become the era in which everybody seems to be able to film these cases. But this was, at the time, the moment where a
Right,
video
right.
recorded Rodney King being viciously beaten by police officers. The fact that they were acquitted, of course, was when there was a video of it, enraged people as people are now, and it completely, in many, many cases, changed the landscape for coverage of policing. There had been coverage of, unrest before, but the videotape was especially indicting, right? Now, what
Mhm.
kind of came out of that for a lot of newsrooms was, how do we cover it? What are the real core issues here, and how do you cover it in a way that is authentic, that speaks not to the images that folks wanted to go to first, the use of terms like looting and rioting, but instead
Right.
really begin to look at the core issues behind policing that led to what happened to Rodney King, and also how people responded. So it was, one of my early moments in my career anyway, in which you had to figure out, how do you frame and tell this story authentically and in a way that makes sense. So that was a early beginning for me. But
Right.
what I want to talk about, though, coming out of that and moving forward, is just this: what did I learn from that, and how has journalism evolved in its coverage of police violence? I think at that time, where you had some people doing good work around policing, there was still a big struggle to really understand and appreciate the history of policing, and especially the Black community. I
Yes.
think there's been, some evolution since then. So the idea of Black people saying that we don't have an officer friendly relationship with police is no longer a surprise. But I
Right.
think at one point, when you think about especially the white journalists who are responsible for coverage, there wasn't a deep understanding or really a belief that the police violence was as systemic in African American communities as Black people knew it to be. So
Right.
we've seen, certainly a change in that, in the way these issues get covered and the conversation. And I think there's been some progress on that. But there's a whole nother level of issues around policing that need to come to the forefront that haven't yet. And, I hope that through this period, we're going to see that. One of the conversations that's happening now is it's moved from, okay, do we have policies that could address use of excessive force? Because we've seen some of these policies happen.
Right.
People are still getting killed. So
Right.
there's another level of conversation now that you see coming up, and that's around this fundamental question of what is the role of the police, and should cities defund the police? That's
Yeah,
a whole
LA was
different
talking
level,
about that now.
and some work is being done on the ground. And even in Chicago, where you live, there have been different battles that are adding up to this question of
Right.
what
Right.
defunding actually looks like. And this to me is, when you talk about investigative journalism or the next level conversation around policing, I think as journalists we're very responsible for not just for being attuned to where the next set of not just problems are, but proposed responses to problems are. And defunding the police is becoming one of those next issues that people who are working around policing or police reform are talking about. So I
Right.
think as journalists, one of the issues that we need to be prepared to grapple with is a whole new set of prescriptions for some of the police violence we're seeing. And that part hasn't come out yet. We're still kind of stuck on excessive force issues or reforming police departments rather than
Mhm.
the bigger systemic issue of what is the role of police in our society. I mean, and there's a lot that's been written about that historically. And what does it mean to defund police? And where are efforts happening now, whether it's Los Angeles County or right now in Minneapolis, there's some places in the South that are having this conversation as well. What
Right.
does it look like, and how can we help educate people on the policy prescriptions like defunding the police?
Well, let me do a little historical take.
Mhm.
You're much younger than I, but I'm sure you remember when we looked at apartheid in South Africa, we
Mhm.
looked at it through the lens
Mhm.
of colonization and
Mhm.
occupation
Mhm.
and a permanent kind of occupation.
Mhm.
We many, and even I wasn't born then,
Mhm.
but when I came along, it was okay, let us undo apartheid. So we looked in lots of places, corporations, university. Are you in any way funding the operation of South African society?
Mhm.
Uh, and if you are, we need for you to divest,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Then we looked at what's his name, Nelson Mandela,
Mhm.
and others come along, and we were all in the streets over, especially on college campuses,
Mhm.
about South African apartheid.
Mhm.
Then we looked at the ANC coming to power
Right.
and finding out they didn't know what to do, and having, unfortunately, to rely on the people they wanted to overthrow to help them run the society, and loads of corruption. Now, when we look at the United States, and many of us, like me, would say it's a different kind of apartheid
Mhm. Mhm.
in its systematic forms of racism that are
Mhm.
very much in place, have been in place
Mhm.
for a gazillion years.
Hmm.
Uh, and when we have an opportunity to think about policy change,
Mhm.
the models that we have, we know where they went wrong. And
Hmm.
we're not a society where, like South Africa, where blacks were I mean, actually on the ground, kept
Hmm.
from learning things that run a society. We're on the ground, and you're at the Center for Public Integrity. Others are professors. Some are physicians,
Mhm.
engineers, architects, all of these things. Is that going to change how we understand policy?
Hmm.
Because if we do the same old
Mhm.
thing,
Mhm.
we haven't done anything.
Hmm. So how will history, I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. Are you talking about how is research going to inform where we go?
Yeah,
Mhm.
because it has to be
Mhm.
there so
Mhm.
that people
Mhm.
don't reinvent a bad wheel.
Mhm. Right, right.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Well, as far as the journalism piece goes, I mean, I don't know if I'm qualified to speak about it more broadly from what activists or those who are working on the policy changes
mhm,
and trying to make happen. My job is not to be in that lane, but to, I hope accurately and contextually report about what responses people are calling for, right, on the
right.
ground, like defunding the police. So I think in any responsible journalism, if we were to cover, or I would say when we cover defunding the police, I think there's a couple of questions we just have to ask. One, I where is it? Where is it happening, and how are those efforts going? Well, first,
Right.
what does that look like? And I think sometimes we see it as a big grand thing, but those skirmishes around getting it done are
Yeah,
happening now, and they are in direct conversations about. They're as simple as reducing the amount of money in a city's municipal budget to policing, just simply
right.
reducing the amount, to not hiring more police officers, to investing a portion of that money instead into community services and community support programs. These things, this concept of defunding is playing out in a number of small ways in cities across the country already. I
But
think the
isn't that um, a misunderstanding? In order to get some control over bad police behavior,
Mhm,
I gotta defund them, meaning
mhm,
I have less
mhm,
police on the street,
mhm,
and
mhm,
that's somehow
mhm,
connected with
mhm,
giving money to
mhm.
communities?
Well,
You gotta defund the police to give money?
one of the larger arguments, as I understand it, being made with defunding is this: if cities have a finite budget,
Right,
and that's
and
you're
Corona is eating it up.
yeah, well, and even without Corona,
Mm,
you're paying for it with your tax dollars.
right,
But cities have finite budget, and if you look at any budget, from a high level point of view, a budget is a statement of policy priorities, what you value, right?
right,
Just like what you spend your money on is a statement of what you value.
which
Of
means
necessity,
people
but
should be
no.
present at all those city council meetings. Or
Well,
what have you.
I mean, there's concepts around the world, and communities where people do what's called participatory budgeting, which means that regular folks get to have a say in how their dollars are allocated, because
Right,
the dollars are coming off of you, whether it's sales tax or property taxes.
right,
So at its core, defunding would argue, if the city has a finite amount of money, is it the and we know that there are many issues that especially communities of color have to deal with. Does it not, if you do defund policing, which means taking money out of policing budgets, where look at the things you can do, which would
okay,
be more, for example, more health centers, more community-based resources. So the big picture argument is, if resources are finite, make more critical choices based on values of equity about where that money can go. So is investing the lion's share of your city budget in policing the place you want to put your money when you have a range of other issues? And if you freed up money from policing, what are the possibilities for creating a more equitable city? That's the
Mhm.
larger, the big picture premise. Now, my job isn't to defend whether it's right or wrong or whatever. The
Mhm.
What I'm trying to capture and express is the bigger picture idea of that. Now, folks
Mhm.
who support that would argue there is a connection between the two. That
Mhm.
because city dollars are finite, if you take money from here, you can put money there. But the other question becomes, what is the connection between policing and the state, especially of some African American communities? What is the role of policing in those communities, and how does that change or not change some of our expectations? Do we expect police officers to be social workers as well as, folks who are going to break up disputes? It opens the door for, as some folks have said to me, a different way of thinking and imagining what communities could be and where and how police are engaged in communities.
So, given that this weekend is supposed to
Mhm,
have heightened
mhm,
conflict,
mhm,
how are you going to collect the data?
mhm,
I know I won't get it
mhm,
today or in the
mhm.
morning,
Right.
but what kind of
Mhm,
data do you
mhm,
want to go collect?
mhm. Well, I mean, there are a million and one things. A lot of organizations are equipped to do that anyway. There are organizations that are out there that are going to be cataloging arrests around the country, right? Which is,
Oh, okay.
a set of data that is valuable to have when comparable moments happen again. Um, who are the people being arrested? What are the charges? I mean, people are positioned now to collect that information, and if they, obviously to ask for that information. So there'll be some collecting of that as best folks
Do
can.
they then report that to you?
Well, I mean, it's not that easy.
Okay, okay,
Essentially, the arrest records are going to come from police departments in most cases,
okay,
right?
okay,
Um, and here and in any other city, that data is going to go to police, is going to go in the form of police records. And there's access to that information that we can get to be able to quantify just something as simple as how many people were arrested, and to do a deeper dive is going to require more. One of the questions, as you'll remember in Minneapolis this week, is how many of the folks were from out of town. So when you arrest
ah,
people,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and where you're from, that myth that these were outside agitators was pretty quickly blown up. When the myth was blown up, when at first city officials were saying it was like, 80% or something, and then they found of those arrested, it was less than 20% were from out of
Right,
town
right.
or out of state, more to the point. So there's data like that, just who's being arrested, that people will capture anecdotally and then later go back and do a deeper dive on that through getting access to the police information we can get. There's certainly going to be just informal counting, which we want to know, right, as journalists, as to how many people were actually out on the streets across the country. Um,
Right.
I mean, those are some important things to have. And the other big piece will be, and you're seeing this emerging with these stories around that you saw in Buffalo the other day, police officers and their response to
Oh my God, did you see
that.
that?
Yeah,
Ah,
that's data, folks are going to want to have what kind of, what cases are happening with police officers as, some of them respond to protesters. So there's a lot of data to get out of this amount and, compare it to past situations or simply to have so we can look using data to understand on a deeper level what's going on with this moment. And you're really kind of coming back to the one of the important tools for investigative journalism, which is to be able to have data. I mean, we can say a lot of stuff anecdotally, but
yeah,
if
yeah.
you're really trying to show a pattern of practice, you
Oh,
don't show a
yeah.
pattern of practice based on I said this. You show a pattern of practice based on the data and analysis and contextualizing it. And so data is so central. That's why right now, with a lot of the work that has been done around policing and where you see groups asking for information, a lot of it is about access to more data about
Mhm.
police conduct. There in Chicago, it was looking, it was fighting to get access for complaints. In police union contracts, one of the things that is typical is to shut down records after so many years. So my paper trail on a police officer who may be involved in some, issues now, lawsuits or complaints, the paper trail only goes back so many years by intent. So information, which is, what journalists do, but also what communities desperately need, is a critical part of being informed, so you could see where patterns of behavior, where and how systemic problems play out. So the data piece is key, whether it's for the public, or it's for journalists. But obviously, in investigative journalism, the data is the pattern, and that's the systemic problem that we're always looking for.
Now, let me ask you one last question, and you've been very generous with your time, and I know I gotta bake you a cake or something.
I'll
How
take a place to sleep when I come to Chicago.
Okay, well, we got a room.
Okay.
One of the things that has been coming up very, very recently in the last few days is, how do we know who's out there? We have the National Guard, we have police, we have prison guards, and we have white militia. How can all those people be out there against protesters? And what does a militia person have over another militia person who might be protesting? Why is our government permitting people who have no nameplates, no insignia for what branch they work for? Are they being allowed to police these protesters?
Well, I want to say two things. One, I think we always need to make sure that we're vetting the source of information for this. And I'm not going to say don't buy into everything that you hear or that may be presented. I think this is to me, a complicated and challenging moment for the spread of misinformation, precisely because we have so many ways to misinform people, through let's go back to the beginning. You were talking about Snapchat, TikTok, Twitter, all the ways in which you can take information that may come from a very, very unreliable source and spread it as if it's gold. And we don't know. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that there aren't some cases of, militia doing this or white supremacists. I'm not saying that's not true, but I think the scale of it and the scope of it and vetting where the information is coming from is really, really critical now. And right now,
but how do we do that? If
well, that's a whole other thing
CNN is putting, Rachel Maddow is zeroing in on these men who have no nameplates and no other identifying stuff.
But see, it's not saying that it's not true. What I want to push back on is two things. The scale of it is the issue, right? Scale. Is how widespread is that, and where is that happening? Scale is important. And two, the issue that the other issue is, it is vetting sources, because something happening and it being extremely widespread are really things that people need to be very, very clear about. Because if you leave folks with the impression that it's just widespread happening everywhere, that's not moving any argument forward. So my point is really two. Being able to better vet sources matters. So if you see this on Rachel Maddow and it's true, we're not thinking that that's happening everywhere in the country at some really incredible live scale. I think it's very, very important to put those stories in scale and in context. Not that they don't exist, but that they have to be looked at in terms of scale. The second part of that to me is really important at times like this is vetting where the information comes from. So we know that as far as disinformation, African American communities were heavily targeted during the last election, during the midterms,
Right,
during
right,
Trump's election with misinformation.
right.
And the misinformation came through sources that those who wanted to confuse the facts thought would be acceptable to African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
names and organizations. So we just need to be extremely mindful. We could have a whole different conversation about how that works and operates. And I think that I'd be happy to come back and talk a lot
Oh,
more
yes, yes,
about
yes.
those issues. But I think there are folks who really are doing incredible work on this. And I always just caution that, I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff out there and a lot of it is true. But
Yeah.
it really has to be a sense of, okay, I saw this, this is happening here, but does that mean that it's happening dramatically all over the country? That it's happening is bad, but the scale point is really, really important. So there are lots of organizations that are doing some great research around misinformation, and I want to just shout out a couple of them. There's a group called Data and Society, and for your listeners, it's really valuable to go and see the work that they've done around reporting out the spread of misinformation as it targets all communities, but targets people of color communities. So
Can you say that name again?
It's called Data and Society. Their work is really, really important. And there are a number of folks, including also African American scholars around misinformation who are doing this work as well. And some of the folks I think are important to know. There's a woman named Michelle Ferrer whose work has looked at the trolling of Black women in particular online. So there's a lot of interesting work in this space of misinformation that we need to read to give us a sense of how it plays out and give us some sense of how to begin to vet, as I like to say, information, because it's coming. We're being assaulted with information from everywhere. It's hard to determine what's real, what's not really that big of a deal. And what we don't have in this country at a time when we really need it is some core media literacy. And to me, organizations like Data and Society and others at least give us a fighting chance at being able to process and understand how what shows up on Twitter or Facebook or TikTok or whatever else is or is not reflective of truth. So that's really important. As far as, the things we're seeing about white militias and other things, I'm not saying those things aren't true. I do think that it's always important to think about scale and context when we talk about these. But one last thing I do want to say, we know, and it's been written about, and it has been documented. I remember one of the earliest things that, as a young woman in Houston, Texas, I remember seeing were these images and stories of how the police department way back in the day had very clear Klan and Nazi members. So we know that there is no brick wall historically between justice groups and law enforcement officers. That is documented. There have been books written about it. So there is clearly a historical truth there that carries on today, and we don't need to forget that history. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I'm saying that isn't happening. It's been documented, and it's part of the truth of our legacy. What's important for us, I think, and this is everybody, journalists are struggling with educating themselves about the historical context for so many issues in policing. So I would say for us as journalists, the big question moving ahead is we've got to know our history deeply around systemic racism, around issues of policing, and a range of other issues to be able to responsibly and truly accurately report about what's happening at this really important, and I would argue turning point moment in the United States.
Oh, that was so nice. Thank you so much. This was Critical Talk, speaking with Susan Smith Richardson, who is the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity. And we're going to take you up on your wonderful gift to us of being willing to come back and talk to us some more about all the things we couldn't cover today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, and be well.
You be well. You all be safe in Washington because you're near the center of, they can call it the military, they can call it everybody. So be well.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.